Okay, good evening. Welcome. So I should get going. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Mun Summ, Wong, and Richard Hassell here at the GSD, and really delighted that we could make this work. You know, getting folks from Singapore as they're crossing over is hard. We got you guys, and so it's wonderful that you're here to share with us your unique work in Singapore and Asia more broadly. And it's also very nice to have some representation here at the GSD of work from the Asian tropics. I think we don't seem to have enough of that discussion here, I think except for Professor Rowe's courses which look at Southeast Asia. I think the representation of these geographies is tremendously poor, and so it makes this lecture today very special, and that's why I think we've all made a great effort to have you guys here to hear about what these issues are and work from that part of the world. Mun Summ, Wong, and Richard Hassell, WOHA, from the first two alphabets of their surnames, have built an amazing reputation as a firm in the last couple of decades. They founded WOHA in 1994, and since then their work has been really characterized by a constant evolution, but also incredible innovation. Their work largely sort of based throughout Southeast Asia, China, Australia, and now more recently their practice is currently engaged with projects under construction in Singapore, India, China, Indonesia, and in India, in Mumbai, and none less than the Trump Tower in Mumbai, which is a very interesting project. I'm not sure they're going to talk about it today, but it is a very interesting project. In the context of Mumbai, I think what they've managed to achieve, being someone who's worked there for many years, is quite amazing. Their projects range from apartment towers to luxury resorts, mass transit stations, hotels, educational institutions, and public buildings of a whole kind of spectrum. WOHA has demonstrated, I believe, an approach to building that takes on large-scale capital and the paradigms that it generates, but localizes it brilliantly within the context of the tropics. Such responses to climate, passive sort of approaches, which have been often demonstrated at much smaller scales, is what differentiates their work from many of their peers, because what they've managed to do is to ramp up these programs and the kinds of issues that you deal with in the tropics up to an amazing scale across programmatic variations that don't easily lend themselves to these architectural configurations informed by thermodynamic thinking and more generally climatically sensitive architecture. WOHA has won an unprecedented amount of architectural awards for being a Southeast Asian practice. They've received the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2007. They collected 4 awards at the RIBA International Awards of 2011 and 12 for villas they've done, School of Art in Singapore, the Met, which is a high-rise building, etc., and an MRT station. They also won another 2011 RIBA Lubetkin Prize and the 2010 International Highrise Award for the Met building. I think their versatility is what has given them this sort of global recognition, and the practice also won 2 titles in 2 consecutive years in 4 separate categories at the World Architecture Festival 2009 and 10. So it's an amazing range of sort of recognition. And lastly, in 2011, they had a they had an architectural exhibition at the Deutsches Architekturmuseum in Germany. They have also had 3 substantial monographs on WOHA, the architecture of WOHA, and a 2-volume piece which is called WOHA Selected Projects. Really weighty books which do great justice to the spectrum of their engagement and their architecture. Mun Summ Wong graduated with honors from the National University of Singapore in 1989 and has been very active there as a practitioner and on many advisory panels in the development of Singapore more broadly. Richard Hassell graduated from the University of Western Australia in 1989 and was awarded a Master of Architecture degree from RMIT in Melbourne 2002. He has lectured at universities. They both have and has served as an adjunct professor at the University of Technology in Sydney and the University of Western Australia. Today they'll speak to us about the Garden City, Mega City, Strategies for the 21st Century Sustainable City. In the 21st century, the century promises to be incredibly different from the 20th century. So they asked the question, why are cities being planned using components that were developed during the last 100 years, and especially in the Asian context? And so they're going to share with us some of those ideas about hyper-dense cities of the 21st century and how you can make them great places to live in. So please join me in welcoming Richard and Mun Summ.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul, for that lovely introduction.
Thank you.
Yes.
Who wants to control that?
You can control it.
Okay.
So. Rahul, 45 minutes, is it we aim for? Good. Okay, so yeah, we're practicing in Southeast Asia and in the tropical belt. We're really in one of the regions where most of the world's megacities are going to come up in the next 50 years. So by 2015, there'll be 35 megacities.
Currently there's 35 megacities. And then I think in 2050, I think it will be close to 50 megacities. And I think it's something that I think it hasn't quite dawned on us, this kind of scale that the cities have become. It's no longer the cities of 1 to 2 million, but it's really cities that are actually above 10 million.
And we're interested to see, having gone to Mumbai and Delhi a lot recently, this Gustave Doré engraving from the Industrial Revolution in London, a street scene. And now when we see the next slide, Mun Summ, is in the streets of Delhi, almost exactly the same as kind of scene of this teeming street life, people piled one upon the other, super dense cities. And that basically this is a back lane in Singapore, but what you see, I think what we've tended to see is that modernism has been bolted on to a lot of these cities, so they maintain very old fabric, but we're not really reconfiguring with the technology that we have a new form of city. And where we have done it, so this is a Singapore housing estate. It's got all the ingredients of a really functional, well-planned city, the light rail, the public housing. But when it's applied in this very rational way and multiplied too many times, it's not a particularly inspiring environment. So one thing we've been playing with is this idea of, so out of that industrial revolution in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, this idea of the garden city as the sort of perfect environment of hygiene, light and nature, but something that really doesn't work at hyperdensity, and combining that with a sort of megastructure of this hyperdense city that was imagined in Tokyo. So this was a scheme that we did for a city that was 9 times as dense as Singapore is now off the south of the city. But so this idea of, can you do this romantic, natural garden city at the density of a megacity? And so we've been, basically a lot of our projects, you can see there are almost components of this imaginary city of the future. And some things we've been thinking about are these strategies for how to create this kind of city.
Well, I think we've been thinking about how cities shouldn't be no longer planned like two-dimensionally. And I think you end up with developments that are island by roads. And I think that's one thing that we've been constantly thinking how we do need to create multiple levels of planning rather than just one dimension or two dimension. And the other thing that we've been toying, particularly in Asia, where and particularly in the tropics, where we have such abundance of sunlight, whether the roof should be flat as a city rather than your romantic New York skyline, which has its highs and lows. primarily because if it's flat, we can actually use it as an infrastructure to sort of bring together buildings that would support a canopy or PV cells. Something that we will demonstrate with one of our projects that's actually taking place in Singapore. And also how with the solar canopy too, below that, we also then have a very large datum level where we can actually use as urban sky farms.
So some other strategies, multiple ground levels. So this idea that once at a certain density, the ground plane is simply too crowded and you need to start creating these multiple ground levels, what that might mean for planning a city. Both and architecture is a term we use. We're thinking about how more than just cross-programming, it's a sort of mix of infrastructure and architecture, or even agriculture and architecture, or forestry and architecture. So really thinking how we can put together things that are normally kept quite separate. The idea of high density and high amenity, they're often seen as contradictory, like the higher density you go, the less amenity, because everyone has to share the same amount. But if you create amenity at the same or greater rate in your density, we think there's no limit to how pleasant it potentially could be. And this idea of sky villages that, despite something being so enormous, you can create communities within it that have a sense of being local and meeting your neighbours, and that romantic sort of village notion.
This couple of strategies here really is kind of related to maybe tropics, where I think very overlooked is how we could actually create tropical community spaces. I mean, terminologies like plazas are not practical in the tropics. We do need shaded and sheltered spaces so that the activities can happen all the time. And also we're dealing with larger, higher density structures tend to be mega structures. And we have been also strategizing how we could actually break down the scale and to domesticate it. And one of those things are what we call perforated towers. And you'll see later on some of our buildings how it actually does allow wind and breezes to actually move through it and to create quite comfortable spaces within the towers. And also the notion of how buildings should ideally be only one room or one apartment thick, so that it's actually like a very thin piece of thickness where you can actually allow breezes and wind to actually move through it as well. These are kind of a couple of climatic strategies that we have evolved over the last, so almost 10, 15 years now. And things that we tend to talk about is how buildings are wind machines. And in this case, we have broken them down into things like terms like horizontal breezeways, where building blocks do help funnel the wind through them and actually cause very effective cross ventilation through the one-room thick blocks. And then we have also created breezeway atriums, which are open on two sides, but with covered on the top. And also the idea of breezeway canopies and courtyards, where we have tend to elevated the courtyard from the ground so that we can actually effect a very effective cross ventilation through the courtyard. And also vertical breezeways, we've been quite successful with this now, where the buildings itself creates a hot stack effect, where you do have air movement from the lower levels going up to the building and actually effecting a very effective cross ventilation across the rooms and the thickness of the buildings.
Just because when we did our exhibition in Frankfurt, and the German writer for doing the catalogue, she was going, all this talk of wind, it sounds so unpleasant. And so only when she came to Singapore and realised how hot and humid it is and what still air we have, So this idea of wind, which sounds a bit obsessive, or breezes, is really the key to a low energy solution in any tropical development. The minute you create a pocket of dead air, it's actually unbearably hot and humid. So strategy of integrating greenery, so this has been something we've been really interested in for the last 20 years, really. And so just different ways of incorporating them, screens of green, using walls of creepers or green walls to make use of the vertical surface. Sky gardens being just any kind of horizontal surface where you can take put the plants. And sky parks were more ambitious, linking up a whole series of sky gardens into a large public space. And the final one, topographic architecture. So there's a strange kind of family of forms that you associate with architecture, but once you start putting plants all over them, there's the old sort of divide between constructed elements being different from nature starts to blur. So thinking of ways that natural formations actually can inform the way buildings are conceived. And then finally, as we were going through these and thinking about this 21st century city, we were thinking that there need to be metrics or measures that might be able to track this development, or to ensure that some things we think are really important could be compared and measured between different developments. So we've started using these measures to sort of analyze our buildings and track where they're going. So I think green plot ratio is something that's becoming quite a commonly used term, but essentially what proportion of your site area is available for gardens. The next one, community plot ratio, this idea of high density, high amenity, so making sure that the ratio of community space to other programmatic areas is kept the same or enhanced as you do a hyperdense development. Ecosystem contribution index, so we're thinking of how with all this potential for nature, to then take it one step further and say how productive is the nature and how much does it support plants and animals and insects in the city. Civic generosity index, so this is something we were trying to think, well, if you characterized your development or building as a person, what kind of person would it be? Is it a selfish, mean, psychopathic person who closes out everything else, or is it a welcoming, generous, open and friendly kind of development? And last one, self-sufficiency index. So if we were working towards this city that has shrunk its ecological footprint to the size of the city, that would obviously score the top score for a self-sufficiency index. So at what point of the journey towards that are we at the moment?
So we kind of see all our projects as prototypes, in that we have been trying to sort of move each building type that we do a little further, and hopefully treat it as a prototype that we can actually use in a new and different way. So we'll be going through a series of our buildings and highlighting some of the strategies that we have taken that I mentioned earlier, and how they have evolved as prototypes for us, and also possibly prototypes for the new Asian city. So this was one project that we took part in the year 2001. It's something that was a competition. It's a public housing project of about 2,000 units. We didn't win this competition, but it was quite important to us because it sort of formalized a lot of our thinking about high density, high-rise solutions. And one of the building that actually eventually got built is the Pinnacle in Singapore. But one of the fundamental difference between the building that was actually built and the building that we envisaged was really about the idea of creating communities in the sky, rather than purely just having homes that are just elevated above the ground. But our thinking really was how we could actually create people who would start to bond and to actually know one another fairly well. And some of these strategies that we really adopted were things like creating one-room thick apartments, but sort of arranged in a way that they actually divided into horizontal datums, many multiple ground levels, and where you actually do enter your homes, or where you go to your homes, you're actually walking through horizontal streets rather than taking an elevator up to your apartment, which normally what high-rises would do. But the idea really is to create people to come up to a certain level and actually allow them to actually walk horizontally to actually connect to all the buildings, but at the same time, it's like a street. You actually start seeing people, knowing your neighbors, making friends, and the sense of community would actually happen from there.
This is a floor plan. It's basically 9 point blocks in a way, towers with a core in the middle. But the difference is they're linked up with a matrix every 5 floors. The 4 little squares you can see at each end, they're the high-speed lifts. So the idea is you would take a high-speed lift up to a street every 5 levels. You would then walk through the street back to your apartment through a series of parks. These are the sort of spaces that you get between the blocks. So although on plan it looks fairly congested, in fact the distance between the towers is about 18 metres, which is the same as the streets of Chinatown where this development is located. And by dividing it up and having these trees and human-scaled elements between the towers, the 18 metres actually feels quite a comfortable street scale, despite the fact that they're 50 stories tall.
This project did get built. This was after 2 years after the competition in 2011. We were given this opportunity to actually build this fairly high density, sort of a high-end development in Bangkok. And I think we managed to use a lot of the ideas, a lot of the strategies in the Duxton Plain competition and actually realize this mega structure. I think one of the things that we eventually did create was to actually, instead of having a very big and dense building, we actually pull the buildings apart into actually 6 very tall and skinny towers, but actually allowing almost all 4 sides of the apartment to be to have windows so that you can actually have very good cross ventilation through it. I think this was one of the things that we wanted to do, was to ensure that the apartments could be cross-ventilated and that you could actually open your windows and your sliding doors to your balconies and actually enjoy the outside. When we arrived in Bangkok to do this project, we realized that a lot of the apartments there were actually built like offices. A central core with actually sealed curtain wall spaces, and actually this actually did set a standard in Bangkok that allow people to actually enjoy a tropical living in the sky. So this is a plan, a typical plan where you can see it's actually 6 individual towers attached to 3 cores. And connecting all the 6 towers would be horizontal structures that are also forming private swimming pools as well as a community public spaces on 2 levels in the building. So that will be on the 9th floor, where you almost have a new ground level where you have all the recreational and community spaces. And you can see here at the 9th level, we do have all the facilities like the gym. And also, we put a lot of water on this level. And one of the reasons is that they actually would actually draw the air up through the spaces up to the top. And we have done some tests now, and that we actually managed to have this air movement of between 1 to 1.5 meters per second movement of air from the bottom to the top. So if you sort of open your windows in your apartment, the air would actually go through the apartment and then get drawn up to the top. So these were the spaces in between the block where there is this, the hot stack effect happening.
This kind of open plan allows you to get rid of most of the vertical surfaces through the building. So they become quite basic buildings in a way where you just have the lift, you have the water pumped up and down, but there's none of the vertical extraction of toilet exhaust, kitchen exhaust. You can have individual unit cooling as well. So in fact, City of Sydney recently did a study and found that even in Sydney's mild climate, 60% of the energy use of the building was just in the common areas for the car park and the lift lobbies and this ventilation, which seems extraordinary considering that's only 20% typically of the building area.
So this would be one of the units on every 6th floor, which is a duplex unit, which has the living and the dining spaces flowing into private swimming pools and gardens. Then you can actually see all the swimming pools that are stacked 6 stories up into all the way up 66 floors. This was a lot smaller project, but it was also almost done at the same time as Newton Suites. But what we really were really keen on this one was how we could actually create sort of the small sort of a sky gardens in the development, so that you can actually compensate for the lack of size in the apartments. These were, at the point of time where we developed this, became the smallest apartments in Singapore. And in Singapore, where most of the people live in high-rise apartments and in public housing, they don't actually understand the sense of actually living on ground. We wanted them to actually be able to enjoy a small piece of garden and to actually feel like they're actually quite close to landscape.
This was one where they just changed the regulation in Singapore too to make common gardens in the building not considered as floor area. And that made a big difference to the economics of it, because land costs in Singapore is very, very expensive. So if you lose area for gardens, that means the developer can't sell that area for apartments. So by making it free of floor area, the developer pays to build these little gardens, but he doesn't lose any saleable apartment area. And that was basically the key to unlocking all the future projects where we use these gardens in Singapore.
So the plan is actually quite simple. There's only 4 units per floor, and there's sort of 2 lifts for the entire development, and they sort of worked around a small little sky garden and a fire escape that is actually used to maintain the vertical greenery in the development. So a cross section of it, you have this little sky gardens every 5 floors, and so when you come back home to your apartment, it's like coming back home to a house where you actually see a garden first before you open your door into your apartment.
Another trade-off we did was in the lift speed, because lifts come in sort of quantum jumps of speed. So the lift engineer had said, no, for a building of this height, you need faster lifts. Because of the waiting time, there's always a number of seconds waiting time. We said, but we think you can have maybe 5-10 seconds more waiting time when you've got a garden outside the lift and a view versus an internal a lobby. So the lift engineer didn't agree, but the client agreed. And no one has ever said the lifts are slow, because the time feels very different when you're looking at a little garden.
The apartments are actually quite small. The two-bedroom apartments was something like 60 square meters. So we do have young families living in here, and what happens is that instead of sort of feeding the kids in the apartment, they actually bring them out into these common sky gardens and actually have them sort of fed here. But also very popular with expats to young working adults who actually smoke. So coming to these little gardens, they all come together and they actually smoke in this area, and it's highly popular for sort of young adults as well. I think what was really interesting for us was that we got a complaint from one of the homeowners on the 24th floor, and when we found out the complaint was that the kids got stung by bees, we were actually quite happy to note that actually we managed to have insects, living creatures, all up that 24th story.
We also did full sun shading up the tower. It was, I guess, in a way, a little bit of a statement that, against all the glassy sculptural buildings that were appearing, which we felt were really not a good direction for the tropics. So we have a sort of a, we thought it was a bit like those hairy caterpillars, which have covered with spikes and fur all the way up. But in a high-rise building, your wall area is the greatest proportion of your facade that's taking in the sun, the heat of the sun.
So we didn't win the Duxton Plain competition in 2001, but after about almost 7-8 years, the government did approach us to try and realize some of the ideas that we wanted to try and do in that competition. But I think one of the things happened in Singapore was two elections ago, the ruling party didn't return with a very favorable majority. They realized their popularity actually dipped. And one of the things that the government actually did realize was that people were not, they needed to actually reinforce the idea of communities within public housing. And I think that was a complete turnaround when they awarded the Pinnacle at the point of time, where they wanted public housing to emulate private developments, condominiums. So now they realize that public housing really should be about how to create communities and to actually cement social bonds in the people. So they realized that they actually approached us to try and realize some of the ideas in our competition. So this is a drone video of the almost completed building. One of the towers actually is finished and handed over to the new homeowners.
There's in a way, picking up on some of those ideas of the other projects. So you see here it's a tower, but the apartments have been pulled apart. And what we did here was create a physical space in the middle of the tower. So as everyone comes out of the lift, they cross through a volume, an 11-story volume. It has a park on the roof that links up the entire building. And that supports a solar canopy, which partially powers the common areas. They're very basic buildings. It's all just precast concrete. Peter, we brought Peter, Professor Roy, to come and see it. And, he's not that great at high-rise buildings. So it's these spaces within which we think are really interesting, that it's not just a solid object that you perceive from the outside, but it's actually quite a complex series of interlinked spaces on the inside. And sort of every available horizontal surface has been used to create this amenity for the residents. So despite the fact that it's almost 1,000 apartments on not a particularly huge piece of land, it's got a huge amount of space for community activities.
You want to explain these diagrams, Richard?
Yeah, so the idea was we felt 960 houses was really, it's too many families to get to know each other, so we were interested to create a sort of smaller unit. So the idea was that every apartment belongs to a village, and a village has 80 homes in it. So we have 12 villages of 80 homes, and these share this physical volume of a sky village level, and then as you come out of your lift, you will cross this volume, you can look down into it, and it has a completely different sort of sense of scale to what you would normally expect in a 47-story building that this is. So the plan here shows, so it's this diamond-shaped plan, so that's the big move, is really to open it up into this diamond and create the space inside. And then if we zoom into one diamond, you'll see that, so we dropped apartments on one side of it as a double volume space, and this is has gardens and spaces for just meeting and having a barbecue. So vertically, each tower is divided up into these 4 villages. And these are the kind of spaces. As public housing, they don't have a sort of very active management, so they're quite simple. But we included furniture and things to give it a sort of an outdoor living room feel. So they have lamps and side tables and concrete benches.
The previous slide was the rendering we did, and then this is actually the finished product. And this was also the rendering that we did originally for at the start of it. And one of the things that was quite important for us was really to maintain sort of visual contact between one person, between these 80 homes and that common space. It's actually up to 8 to 9 stories, and 11. That what 10?
11 total.
11 total. And I think that was actually the furthest that we will go, so that you actually, when you're up at the 11th story, when you look down, you still can actually recognize the person on the common space.
The idea is your kids would play here. You would bring the dog here to walk it.
Yeah.
You could just have, so there's a very different thing that you can step out of your apartment door and call your kids home for dinner, for instance, which is something in a typical high-rise you just can't do. And interesting way it sort of frames the city and pulls the views into this space in the middle.
So this is a different kind of development. This is actually a School of the Arts, actually located in the heart of the civic entertainment district of Singapore. And this was actually a very compact specialized art school for young kids from 12 to 18 years old. And the idea of actually creating, basically creating a performing arts facility on the lower levels and a very safe and secure environment for the young students who actually study art and music. And we've been able to create actually very distinct ground levels on the lower level, and then on the 5th floor, a very large new ground level where it's actually used as the assembly area for the school, and also another roof level where we actually use for the recreational space for the school. But one of the more poignant kind of idea we had was that we needed to keep the kind of public school specs, and one of the things was that the school had to be really most of the classrooms were not allowed to be air conditioned, so we had to think of a way that we can actually make the classroom work with natural ventilation. And what we did was that we actually created 3 classroom blocks and treated them like breezeways where we could actually funnel winds through it and through the classroom blocks. This was on the lower level where we actually have the 3 performing arts facilities. And it's actually a public thoroughfare. Anyone can actually walk through it. But what we did was we actually chose not to air condition the pre-function spaces of the theaters, and this were actually used for other uses like large functions that the school would actually organize. And then behind them, they're actually the performing arts facilities. But on the 5th level, you can see it's almost the entire site area, and this is actually used as the assembly hall, assembly floor for the school. So you can actually see there's light at the other end, so it actually is a true space. And this is where the wind actually gets funneled through these spaces. And because actually the wind does move through these spaces, the classrooms themselves are actually quite effectively cross-ventilated as well.
We have a variety of gardens that float amongst these spaces. So between lessons and lunch break, the kids have outdoor areas to play. And then the roof itself is there's a 400-meter running track around the roof.
This one was a competition entry that we did, but something that would not be built. But I think this was something that we wanted to demonstrate that we could actually think out the box and actually use the stadium as the roof of this large facility. So this was really quite it's an institutional community project where it's actually consisting of many government institutions as well as commercial facilities. But they actually asked for a stadium. And one of the things that we thought that if we actually put the stadium on the ground level, which normally what people would do, is that you will end up with covering a much larger footprint. And what we wanted to do was try and create a natural park that actually joined up with one of the linear park that was actually adjacent to this development site. And actually by putting the stadium on top of the roof, we actually only occupied 50% of the site area. But at the same time, we provided a roof over all the public sort of spaces that we get in the building.
There's another one of the same family. This one is being built in Dhaka in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a pretty hardcore city. It's extremely poor. The population is exploding. I think it's got the fastest growth rate of any megacity in the world at the moment. And it has really severe problems. So this university, BRAC, is owned by an NGO organization which does really great development work, and the courses are all based around development. So we thought it's really nice if the building itself becomes a kind of a teaching tool and a vision for development for Bangladesh. So it's sited in what's at the moment a rubbish-filled swamp. And the idea is the building itself is going to regenerate all the water into a healthy waterway. It's raised up above it, and this whole area is a publicly accessible community space beneath the university.
The kind of typology we have chosen for this too was using horizontal breezeways. And the difference between this and the School of the Arts is that this is actually almost 10 times that size of the School of the Arts in Singapore.
We're using these covered community spaces, but essentially trying to limit which facilities are air-conditioned to the absolute minimum, and using a lot of just passive devices, but in a very large institutional building, so that it's a very low consumer of energy. This is a project that has been built in Singapore, the Park Royal Hotel. And for us, it's something that we've quite excited about because it does incorporate a lot of these ideas we've been talking about in one building.
I think that this drone video kind of shows that this building is actually quite different from the buildings in the surrounding. I think it's visibly green, and one of the things that we managed to achieve really is a green replacement of 200% of the site area, but also at the same time we were able to duplicate the urban park in front of it entirely as horizontal surfaces, gardens in the building.
This has a 200% green plot ratio, which we think is really interesting. So there's twice as many gardens within the building as there would be if you didn't build a building at all. And for us, that was a pretty exciting statistic. And this kind of idea of a building as a real landscape and a romantic, interesting, exciting landscape within the city is something we find very appealing. And interestingly, like for people in the street, it's super appealing too. It's like almost every person, our office is very nearby, so we're always walking past it. And it's really nice seeing people sort of tapping each other on the shoulder and taking photos and selfies in front of it. Just, you know, tourists walking down the street, not architecture, people who are interested in architecture at all.
I think this diagram actually shows you how we actually created the same area as a park with gardens in the building. And what we did was the podium, which actually comprises the car parking and the public areas of the hotel, actually supports the largest area of gardens in it. And then on the upper levels where the guest rooms are, we created 3 levels of sky gardens to actually divide that building that floats above the podium into almost 3-4 stories, a similar scale to the shop houses that's actually in Chinatown that is adjacent to the building. And you can see on the ground floor plan, it's almost an extension of the park across the street. And again, our language of topographical architecture, and what it really does is that it actually supports, it's an infrastructure that supports a lot of landscaping, and also at the same time able to create tropical common spaces. In this case, this drop-off is actually used as an event festival plaza.
The image on the left, I think, is this idea of the civic generosity, that this hotel is something that, this is just the public footpath through the building, but it's like, as you walk through it, you're invited into the hotel in a way and given the same experience as the guests inside the lobby.
And this is a cross-section that actually shows you that we don't have a basement, but we have a podium, and that houses the car parks, and then the guest room blocks above. And on the 5th level, it's almost the entire floor plate that's actually used as the recreational facilities for the guests. And then the multiple levels of the sky gardens that actually almost merge with the urban park in front of it. But when you're on the 5th level, you really don't realize that you're actually above ground. It almost feels like you're actually on real ground level.
It was these kind of areas that gave us this idea that really, it can be, for future projects, can be more than a garden, but can be a true ecosystem if we work with the right kind of plants and things to support a lot of life.
What we managed to do in this hotel development too was that we reduced the air-conditioned areas by 50%. So 50% of the guest room corridors are actually naturally ventilated, and also 50% of the hotel public areas were also naturally ventilated. So it sort of gives people, the guests, a new experience of actually walking through garden walkways into their rooms. And also at the same time creating this vertical garden landscape that's actually facing the public housing across it. And from inside, you can actually see, looking out, it's really just gardens. So in that project, we managed to create a green replacement of 200%. We wanted to actually try to see whether we can actually do it, even achieve a higher percentage. And we managed to do it with this vertical high-rise building. That's also a hotel and offices. And we managed to push the percentage up to 750%. So it's 7.5 times the site area as green replacement.
And that, I think, is quite tremendously exciting, because you could imagine a city of these kind of buildings could have 7 times as much nature as if there was no city at all.
So this is one development that we wanted to show, was really the fact that we created a roof that turns into a park for the people. And I think this was actually built in Penang. And the idea was actually to give back to the people of Penang a public facility for a rather dense development. So to create the large floor plate or public park or sky park, we actually had to use the buildings as structures to support that park. So that project, unfortunately, will not be built, but this one, we managed to get it through. This was a smaller project, which is a elderly home, but it's the first of its kind in Singapore where they are actually mixing elderly home with a medical facility, sort of retail component, as well as a bit of community use. And what we create again was a private sort of a semi-public community park above where the elderly housing will be located. And then basically using the specialist center, the medical center, to actually support this new ground level and sky park. And yet at the same time using this large floor plate to provide a covered space that becomes a People's Plaza. So this is the lower level where you see the People's Plaza and the floor plan of the ground level. But when you see it stacked above, you will have the public plaza at the bottom. You have the retail component, and then the medical facility, which forms the largest floor plate that supports the community park above, where we have the elderly housing. This is something that we are starting to look at, is how to rethink the office building. And instead of just purely an office building for corporate clients, we think that there's a possibility of actually mixing a more mixed use of having sort of so SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, working alongside with corporate firms. And small, medium-sized offices, we tend to think they are different in nature. People would tend to sort of live and work in their offices and their homes. So kind of indistinguishable. And what we wanted to do was to actually juggle this together with corporate offices.
Well, we realized in a lot of old cities, you tend to get this mix anyway, where you'll have the smaller scale buildings within the CBD and then the MNC towers. But as in these new megacities, and like in China, where they'll master plan a whole area, it becomes very much a monoculture of like large corporate towers. So the idea is here that you could have architect's office, advertising agents' offices, graphic designers, mixed up with the large corporate floor plates.
So within one cluster of this, we felt that there was actually a minimum of having a cafe and a daycare facilities for the young and for the old, and this was the minimum for a sort of a creative cluster of sort of small offices and homes. And as expressed as little clusters, they sort of interlock with the corporate offices.
Unfortunately, the things we liked about it was the thing the client didn't like about it. They said, it looks like it's covered with shanties. So we are going ahead with it, but in a different form.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about this.
So this one we showed at the beginning, but it was a scheme we did with a few universities, the Vertical Cities Asia conference. And we wanted to push density up to 100,000 people per square kilometre. And so we led the studio, and we thought we better do the exercise as well, because we weren't sure what it was going to look like. So it's basically 4 times as dense as Manhattan. And if you look at the Burj Khalifa and the population of that building, you would need to put this many Burj Khalifas into a square kilometre. So we thought, in the same way we sort of used smaller components to build our high-rise buildings, we could use our high-rise buildings to build a sort of more intimately scaled mega structure. So we would need 134 of our METs in 1 square kilometre. But if we stack them up in multiple layers, we could fit them in. And so using these as components, we could create this, and using them as columns now to support city conduits. We would still have that cross-ventilation and openness to light and air, even though it could be extended to this huge agglomeration. So it's to take all the population of Singapore, 5 million people, and build another city with the same population and only 1/9 of the floor area. So, I mean, it's a theoretical project with a host of issues, but it actually raised up some really interesting things. For instance, once you have all these multiple ground levels, you don't have the usual choke on a super high-rise tower of everyone trying to get out through the lift and down to the street. In this case, people are going to be going up just as much as they're going down, and they can walk through the city with ever coming down. So your lifting becomes much more efficient, and structurally as well. Super high-rise towers are cantilevers, so they end up very, very over-structured to support it. And in our linked lattice city, they all support each other. So this is a final project we're going to show, which is, it was an actual scheme for a new town in Singapore, which unfortunately we didn't win. But it basically takes all those concepts that we've talked about and the prototypes and puts it together. So this is a city for 200,000 people that actually is self-sufficient in electrical energy, in vegetable production, and in water. So this is the idea of the inverted skyline. So the 20th century city with its bar chart skyline of housing values, we think is actually quite disastrous anytime you're thinking about solar panels, because solar panels, even with the shadow across part of them, they drop in efficiency by half. So the idea is that we have a flat skyline on top, which is a maximum efficiency for harvesting energy and growing food, and we have the skyline underneath. So where the pedestrians are is where you have really interesting volumetric play of spaces at the ground level. We have a full ecosystem, a dense rainforest running right through the city, sharing the ground plane with with pedestrian circulation and public transport. And this is where you see the solar canopy at the rooftop. So this is something that extends out beyond the building footprints and between the buildings. And so this level of PV and about 20 stories, we could harvest enough energy for the city to be self-sufficient. Below this canopy, we have a full farming level. So this is where you can grow vegetables enough for the population within the city as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think let's take a few questions and start a conversation. So, questions? Maybe I'll sort of kick off with, I mean, what's wonderful is to see this dimension of civic generosity. And I think what's brilliant is the way you take or create public space within sort of by shifting the paradigm in the way you organize this. And I think you kind of highlighted how the public garden then actually had an impact on the policy, so right, which then begins to set precedents. What were other such tangible effects that have occurred from the many buildings in Singapore and other places that you've done that you might be able to share with us?
Yes, actually when we did the Newton Suites, the one with the little gardens off the apartment building, it was up for an award, and the chief planner of Singapore's Urban Redevelopment Authority was on the jury. And so she came to see the project and she said, actually, since you've done this with no regulatory requirement and on a normal developer's budget, it's given us confidence to do something we've been thinking about, which is 100% green replacement for the central area of Singapore. So they wrote it into law after that. So now it's fantastic, I think. Yeah. Everyone has to do it, and it's going to transform the centre of Singapore.
Yeah, that's it. Questions? Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you. So a lot of your projects have all your projects have a very strong expressive quality to them. You have a very distinctive kind of formal language to them, but the way you talk about them is very rational on the other hand. And I was wondering why this is. Is it because you often have to present to government as your client, or is this really the way you think, and this kind of formal is just an intuition for you?
I think, well, a lot of what we think is maybe more interesting about what we do is about the sort of strategic, programmatic relationships between the parts rather than formal expression. So we think we're actually pretty good at formal expression, but it's probably not something that we're that interested in talking about, because I think so many other people talk about form as the focus of architecture. So we sort of see form in the service of these bigger ideas, and we do want our buildings to be beautiful and have really elegant detailing and be nicely resolved. But in a way, we're sort of less committed to a formal direction, and we'll take something like that is a very strategic and rational approach to form in a way that we can have a set of details that work nicely together and mean we can resolve, because some of our projects are now up to 1 million square meters, so 10 million square feet. So if you were going to sort of craft the form over that area, you would need a team of thousands of people. So we're very strategic about saying, let's make a language of components, let's detail the hell out of the components. But because we've limited the kind of extent and creep of all the kind of design junctions and things, we can operate quite efficiently.
Peter? Yeah.
As you know, I love this stuff, but one thing occurred to me in looking at the presentation that I never thought of with your work before, and that is, what's the minimum scale? Because virtually all of these projects are very big, and it's fairly obvious that there are advantages to that with respect to the wind circulation and the breezes and the kind of the footprint of the green and all of those sorts of indicators that you're having. But what about in the other direction? About how low can you go, so to speak? It seems to me would be interesting. This suits very much, of course, the Southeast Asian and East Asian circumstance where we're moving to scale. But if we start to move in the other direction, how small a footprint can you make this stuff work on?
Well, we started with smaller projects first, before we sort of escalated to larger ones. And when we actually look back at our smaller projects, even our houses, we realized that the strategies were actually basically almost the same. What we actually talk about now is actually quite evident in all our smaller buildings as well.
I'm not sure they scale the same way, do they?
Well, because a lot of the ideas are basic passive design, so we realized we had done things like, the house is lifted up on stilts, and it's
the houses will actually pull apart
blocks.
so that you can actually have the breezeway within it. So those ideas were actually quite evident in our earlier works, which were small ones.
Forced stairs through the stack effects.
Yeah, so they work better, I would say, than a house on the ground in Singapore, because at the ground level it's super humid and the breezes are blocked by the trees. But in a way, I think, Peter, we are interested in them as sort of strategies for hyperdensity. So in a way, it doesn't quite make sense to say how small can you go with a megastructure, for instance. It's just a structure then.
I withdraw.
Other questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
When I was in Sweden, the projects that they built in the 60s were usually a tower with no real connection to the ground. So the ground became a wasteland, and you didn't have the connection between the interior and the flat. So the flat became basically a no man's land. And I like the way you divide your towers into your 9 or 11 levels so that you can actually see the individuals. I think that's really important, especially for public housing. And then, are you influenced by MVRD and also Dan Kiley's in the interior courtyard in the Seagram's building, perhaps?
Dan Kiley, yes. Well, we have his books.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And MVRDV. Yeah, definitely. I think they've been influences on us. Yeah. Yeah, and I think in some ways our projects have maybe evolved in Singapore, which has an extremely safe public realm as well, I think. So this idea of a building where, because they're fully open to the public and anyone can wander around, in some societies it would probably be, you'd be mugged there, or, if the police were trying to catch someone, there's like 12 ways out of the building, so it's really maybe problematic in some societies. But that, I think the general idea is that all the public space is overlooked by private space. So hopefully, even in other areas, although we haven't tried it, that level of windows overlooking public space that you have in any kind of village or situation where it's fairly safe just through informal surveillance. I think it is probably applicable to many places. The thing about the undifferentiated ground plane, Singapore has square kilometres of that in terms of all the public housing is lifted up on stilts, and there's a continuously accessible public plane at ground level which has very little program in it and very little nodes of activity. So that was something in our scheme where we did try and make them into quite defined spaces with functions. So we didn't really go into it, but there's a plaza surrounded by restaurants and eating stalls. There's community living rooms, which is where all the letterboxes are. So there's a sort of arrival outdoor living room for the whole block where people can meet each other as well. So it was something that definitely is really critical, I think, in terms of programming all that ground floor space so it has a real structure to it.
Thank you. There's a question up there. Yeah, sorry, come to
Yeah, so I'm just wondering on the, so to build this, where, you have trees on the building, I mean, is it more costly just in terms of like supporting the building? So I guess I'm wondering, is it more costly to build, and is it also more costly to maintain it? Because these are trees, and I'm not sure, when they grow bigger, I mean, like, will the building get under pressure, or so just things like that? And of course, in a tropical country, maintaining something like this, do you attract things like, I don't insects, where, in a tropical country where, in some seasons where mosquitoes are just there, how do you maintain this, I guess, herb?
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
So yes, or soil ways, wet soil is fairly similar to concrete in its weight. So if you have a metre deep of soil, it's roughly equivalent to about maybe 5 floors for that area. So there is a load, but what you find normally in a condition of hyperdensity, the land values are already so high that the construction cost is less critical than maximising your floor area potential. So what they've found in Singapore is that the minute they made these areas not considered as floor area restricted by the plot ratio, the cost to build them was not off-putting for the developers. So not just our projects, but many projects in Singapore now have these areas. And the developers saw them as amenity and a selling point, and for them it was worth it.
But I guess our point is that if you're dealing with hyperdensity and really super high density, we must at the same time increase the amenities like parks and gardens. If you don't increase that, it is not a livable environment.
And then, mosquitoes in Singapore, they're well controlled. I guess it's about not having standing water around and making sure you.
But it's something that we do want to encourage is to increase biodiversity within the city. That's the whole point of green replacement, really, is to actually bring back biodiversity to the city.
Yeah.
We have a question there. Yeah.
I'm very inspired by by the success that we seem to see in your sort of loosely defined semi-public spaces. You probably know the project in Rome, Corviale, which is a kind of mega structure which has ultimately failed, although it still could be revived. In this case, the 4th floor, which was planned as this kind of elevated street, was pretty immediately privatized. And therefore it's not open to the public domain. People have moved in and squatted in it. And in some ways that provides a sort of spontaneous, positive character to the place, but it eliminates the possibility of this safe public space. Is there any risk in Singapore of that kind of spontaneous privatization?
Nothing spontaneous happens.
I thought that would be the answer.
But I mean, people would colonise it if they could, but they're quite strict about converting space that's been designated as common space into private space.
So it's really a policy and a kind of enforcement solution, not an architectural one.
Yeah, but one of the things that we thought it through was really that you do need to be able to actually see the common space and to actually move through it on a daily basis rather than it being a destination kind of a public space. And when you don't see it every day, someone could colonize it, whereas it's actually in the public domain and it's like a street that you walk through all the time. It's actually less likely to happen. And I think that was the important criteria for us when we planned those sky villages in the common areas.
I think where we think it'd be interesting too would be this three-dimensional planning we were mentioning, is that if this is taken as a good idea for an entire district, you could then make each building like connectable at a certain level, and at a certain population, I think that would start working. I think these streets off the ground don't really work for commercial. Unless it's somewhere like Hong Kong where they become a thoroughfare from one place to another. So that's where we've looked at them more as community space. where it's a standalone building, because it's very hard to drag people up, up into a building just to visit a shop or a coffee shop or something.
One last game.
Hi, I just wanted to say thanks so much for your presentation. I guess I have 1.5 to 2 questions. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the Civic Generosity Index. How do you come up with that? Is there a pre-assessment, and then is there a reassessment once the building has actually been constructed, or people are living in it and using it? Or is it more subjective in terms of this building didn't have a throughway through all the sort of columns, but this one does, so that's a 5 instead of a 4, and this one has a park and this one doesn't, and that sort of measure. And then just I'm curious, is anyone using your buildings in a way that, again, for these sort of aspirational community building elements, that surprises you?
Good questions. The indexes we've come up with are kind of at their early stages. The University of Singapore actually said they were interested to develop them into a more formal measure. The reason we sort of brought them in was because we deal all the time with developers who talk about, net to gross efficiency, and there's a whole lot of measures out there already, but they're purely about extracting maximum value for the developer. And we thought it'd be interesting to have these kind of measures which would show up the psychopath buildings versus the kindly buildings. And people could say, oh, that new building down the street's only a civic generosity score of 1, boo. So just as a way of comparing buildings. But yeah, it would need to be formalised in terms of, I think, just like a plot ratio, how much space is actually dedicated to this kind of communal amenity versus just corridors and lobbies and
It's a lot more complicated than talking about green plot ratio and community plot ratio, which is just measuring of areas.
Yeah. And the other one was...
It sort of
surprising
had to do,
ways.
Yeah, especially with these community areas and yeah.
Well, we called with the drone, we caught a couple making out, a couple of school, which we thought was really good because Singapore, there's not a lot of areas to do that. So we thought it was already working after being completed about 2 months.
No, even from social media, the comments that we are actually getting, they're all very positive.
Yeah, and we're going to do some post-occupancy evaluation on that building. The nice thing is it's fully accessible, so normally what's really difficult about residential developments is once they're finished, they become gated. So these, we can go in any time and count the couples making out and things, so get some real
if they want to respond.
And the Occupy movement, there's no chance in hell that would happen, right? No. But, just to extend that, the kind of qualitative and the quantitative measures of floor area ratios and things, what about climate related? Because often I think in these kinds of approaches which have to do with passive cooling, these are kind of intuitive moves. And you did mention the rate of the air per second, whatever the number was. Are you doing any monitoring mapping like that?
We have started to, because NUS is Namal Kishnani, who's there doing their environmental postgraduate work. He's got interested in it. So what's nice is he's done a few measurements and is going to come back. So he measured the Met in Bangkok and found those wind speeds for us. And Transsolar out of Munich did some evaluation of the School of the Arts and found it significantly better. He was really interested because he said by right it's not actually in the comfort, the ASHRAE charts about where comfort is. He said it should be just outside, so he was interested to find out why the students weren't drenched in sweat and sleepy.
No, because I think for me the importance of the work, and there are many others, including my colleague Inaki who's here, I think using these sort of ways of manipulating form to accelerate the passivity in terms of performance. On the other end, the high-tech architects have completely hijacked the debate about sustainability. So sustainability has become efficiencies that are chemical and mechanical fixes. And so I think kind of surfacing and kind of publicizing some of these findings findings and developing an alternate narrative which also has this kind of objective language would be a great service to the broader debate. And that's why I was sort of curious about what you were doing with these performance sort of
So we should have, I think in a couple of years, we should have
it'll be I think, really useful for the debate. But thank you very much. WOHA, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.